At 8:40-4 in the morning on June 15, 1940-4, the sky over Saipan in the Pacific was violently torn apart by the acrid smoke of gunpowder, and the once crystal blue waters were mercilessly stained a horrifying crimson. As the heavy steel doors of the American landing craft crashed down with a grinding mechanical roar, the Marines charging forward were not greeted by a pleasant tropical breeze, but by a lethal, unrelenting storm of enemy mortar shells and a devastating crossfire of heavy machine guns. Facing an island fortress heavily guarded by 30,000 elite soldiers of the defending empire, any standard tactical advance straight out of an infantry manual was tantamount to collective suicide. This island was the absolute core of the national defense perimeter, the very first time American forces had touched what the enemy considered their inner territory, and the defenders' will to resist had reached a point of sheer madness. Yet, amidst this apocalyptic meat grinder, an entirely unconventional American squad was preparing to go against the tide and pull off an absolute miracle. Leading the charge into the hail of bullets was 20-9- old Marine Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky. And bounding forward right behind him, completely unfazed by the flying shrapnel, were not poster-boy model soldiers, but 40 criminals who had just been plucked straight from the maximum security brigs of the United States military. They were notorious brawlers, highly skilled thieves, former bodyguards who used to take bullets for mob bosses on the bloody streets of Chicago, and underground prize fighters accustomed to letting their bare knuckles do the talking. They were the military's ultimate problem children, the outcasts every commanding officer avoided like the plague. But destiny has a darkly comedic way of unfolding. It was exactly these 40 unruly, disgraced delinquents who carved a bloody path through the deepest, deadliest jungles of that cursed island. Decades after the smoke cleared, military historians would recognize these exact men as the tactical pioneers of today's legendary Navy Special Forces. Today, we are going to pry open this highly classified World War II dossier that the military deliberately buried for decades, cut through the fog of history, and witness exactly how a band of outlaws known as the 40 Thieves wrote one of the most chilling, unfueled legends in the dark heart of Saipan. To truly understand the sheer insanity of this story, we have to rewind the clocks 11 months earlier to Camp Tarawa in Hawaii. A recently submitted casualty report from the Pacific Theater had the top brass of the 6th Marine Regiments daring in absolute dead silence. The numbers on the paper were sickening. In the brutal island-hopping campaigns, the casualty rate for frontline reconnaissance and sniper units, the guys doing the most dangerous jobs, had skyrocketed to an unacceptable 73%. What does that actually mean? It means if you send 10 of your absolute best scout snipers into the field, barely 3 are walking back alive. The traditional infantry playbooks and combat manuals work completely useless against the suicidal charges of the defending forces and the terrifying, labyrinth mines-like underground concrete bunkers they had spent years carving into the tropical rainforests. Colonel James Risley, the commander of the 6th Marine Regiment, knew deep down that if they kept fighting by the book, they would just be throwing thousands of young American lives into a bottomless meat grinder. They desperately needed a brand new tactical approach, and more importantly, a completely different breed of warrior. So he called upon Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky and handed him a mission that sounded like absolute lunacy: throw away every rule in the book and build a highly specialized reconnaissance platoon that could operate like ghosts deep behind enemy lines, employing ruthless tactics and possessing God-steer survival skills. Upon receiving the order, Tachovsky made a decision that left everyone speechless. He didn't head to the recruit depots to pick out the bright side, obedient farm boys. Instead, he marched straight into the heavily guarded military stockades. Pushing open those heavy iron doors, breathing in the sour stench of sweat and pent-up aggression, he looked past the offenses of severe insubordination, grand theft of military property, and vicious assaults. He was hunting for lone wolves. In Tachovsky's sharp eyes, the brutal, standardized training of the Marine Corps was fantastic for producing disciplined soldiers who could hold a trench line, but it absolutely failed to teach a man how to survive alone in a primordial jungle, entirely cut off from friendly support, surrounded on all sides by enemies who wanted him dead. He needed men who knew how to stay ice-gold in a hopeless situation, men who could think on their feet, men who despised the rules, and most importantly, men who were willing to do whatever dirty, underhanded thing it took to stay alive. Gripping a long disciplinary roster, he began conducting 1-on-1 interviews. After a ruthless screening process, he hand-picked exactly 40 men. The backgrounds of these 40 individuals were staggering. The youngest was barely 17, the oldest 30-4, and shockingly, almost every single one of them had a thick rap sheet with civilian police before they even put on a uniform. Among them were mob enforcers who had survived Chicago Mafia shootouts, underground fighters who regularly left their opponents in a brutal defeat, and even master thieves who could pick any lock and make things disappear into thin air. Standing in front of this lineup of hardened convicts, Tachovsky didn't give them a patriotic speech. He gave them a simple, brutal ultimatum: you can either stay in this dark, rotting cell and let your youth waste away, or you can grab a rifle right now and follow me into the most dangerous, lethal combat zones on the face of the earth. Unsurprisingly, these men who had a reckless craving for danger and freedom woven into their very DNA, they didn't hesitate for a single second. Every last one of them chose the battlefield. But letting these beasts out of their cages was only step one. The training that followed completely shattered every concept the U.S. military held dear at the time. Right in front of his new platoon, Tachovsky practically tore the Marine Corps infantry manual to shreds. He didn't teach them how to march in formation, and he sure as hell didn't teach them how to charge a machine gun, nest in broad daylight. What he taught them were the dark arts of lethal warfare, how to use the pitch-black night to slip silently behind an enemy sentry and subdue him in a fraction of a second using a combat knife for bare hands, how to read captured enemy maps and terrain documents, just like the locals, how to move through dense, thorn-filled jungles like a hunting leopard, fast and deadly, without snapping a single twig or rustling a single leaf. He taught them how to master complex radio equipment, cut through electromagnetic interference, and accurately call down apocalyptic naval artillery strikes from miles away. But here's the kicker. At the time, the Marine Corps was jokingly referred to as the Navy's bastard child. They were the poorest, worst-equipped branch of the military, constantly starving for supplies. Faced with this reality, Tachovsky didn't just turn a blind eye. He actively encouraged his men to turn stealing into a mandatory battlefield survival skill. To maintain their combat edge, these men tapped into their pre-war talents. Under the cover of darkness, they would routinely infiltrate the heavily guarded supply dumps of the well-equipped U.S. Army to liberate premium rations, or slip into Navy warehouses to acquire state art sniper scopes and specialized gear. Sometimes they even hot-wired and drove off with Army officers, jeeps and loaded supply trucks. Because of this absolute disregard for military law and their borderline bandit behavior, the other units of the 6th Marine Regiment gave them a nickname that stuck forever: the 40 Thieves. When the deafening artillery barrage of the Saipan campaign finally kicked off, these hell-forged thieves faced their ultimate exam. Crammed inside the violently rocking landing crafts, every man knew exactly what was expected of them in this brutal assault. They had to hit the beach of death in the very first assault wave, immediately break away from the main invasion force, and drive themselves like a jagged, poisoned blade deep into the heart of the enemy defensive lines without any hesitation. Their mission was to paint targets on hidden bunkers, call in naval gunfire to obliterate them, and survive for days. They needed to survive in the most hostile territory imaginable to gather critical intelligence for the advancing Marines. Standing in their way were 30,000 elite enemy troops who had already sworn an oath of honorable suicide. They had transformed the island into a nightmare of reinforced concrete pillboxes, spider-webbed trench networks, and deep bunkers. U.S. intelligence had already made grim predictions because this was the first time Americans were invading their inner sanctuary. They predicted the ferocity of the defense would be historically unprecedented, and the casualty rate could easily surpass 73%. At 8:47 in the morning on June 15th, the beach of Saipan instantly transformed into a colossal meat grinder. Precision enemy mortar strikes rained down on the waiting Marines, and the terrifying rip of heavy machine guns cut through the air. Young men were mowed down in droves on the softs and unned against the sea walls, turning the surf a sickening shade of red. But astonishingly, from the second Tachovsky and his 40 thieves hit the sand, they didn't hesitate for a microsildont. They had one unbreakable rule drilled into their heads during their brutal training: never, ever stop in the kill zone. Utilizing craters and burning wreckage as cover, they bounded forward with terrifying efficiency, moving like a pack of starved wolves. By 9:30 in the morning, in less than a single hour, this lone platoon had pushed an unbelievable 300 yards straight into enemy territory. They were completely severed from the main American force, surrounded on all sides by an enemy that wanted to tear them to pieces. Operating completely isolated and alone, the crisis hit them incredibly fast as they moved deeper through the dense silent brush. Moving through the dense brush, they stumbled into their first lethal roadblock, hidden perfectly beneath the tropical foliage. Just ahead, perfectly concealed beneath a camouflage net, a reinforced concrete pillbox was vomiting a relentless stream of fire. It was an enemy Type 92 heavy machine gun, completely locking down the open terrain and halting their aggressive advance. By regular military standards, taking out a fortified position like this would require a frontal assault that could easily wipe out half the company. But the 40 thieves didn't do suicide charges. They had their own unique brand of lethal, a artistry forged in the criminal underworld. A quiet, unassuming private first class named Marvin Strombo, a guy who rarely spoke but possessed ice water in his veins, silently slung his heavy bazooka. Strombo didn't attack from the front like a traditional soldier. Moving like an absolute ghost, he crawled agonizingly through the mud. He navigated through the razor-sharp thorns, inching his way to the extreme flank of the bunker until he was a terrifying 80 yards away. 80 yards in close quarters combat is a definitive death sentence. A single snapped twig or a heavy breath would result in him being shredded to pieces. Ignoring the sweltering tropical heat and swarms of biting insects, Strombo held his breath and steadied the heavy rocket launcher. He stared directly through the iron sights, locking on to the impossibly tiny firing slit of the heavily fortified concrete bunker. He meticulously calculated the wind direction and the projectile drop. Then, without a moment of hesitation, he fired a single rocket. With an ear-shattering roar, the projectile carved a flawless, deadly arc through the air, threading the needle right through that tiny slit. Detonating violently inside the concrete tomb, the roaring machine gun went dead instantly. Everything inside was instantly vaporized by the shockwave and hellfire. It was a surgical, textbook execution that didn't cost a single Marine a drop of blood. And for the 40 thieves, this was just the opening act. But a far more terrifying trial was waiting in the shadows of the Saipan jungle. On the afternoon of June 16th, at 3:40 in the afternoon, as the ghostly squad probed deeper into a thick jungle canopy, they stumbled upon a sight that made the blood freeze in their veins. Hidden beneath an elaborate network of camouflage, parked in perfect formation, were 37 enemy Type 97 medium tanks. They had just walked right into a massive, fully operational armored staging area hidden deep within the tropical island rainforest. These steel beasts were idling, radiating immense waves of heat, clearly prepping for a massive, catastrophic night counter-attack against the Americans. Every single thief knew the math. If these 37 tanks rolled out under the cover of darkness and smashed into the fragile beachhead, it would be a massacre. The defense lines would be shattered, and thousands of unsuspecting Marines would be crushed beneath steel treads. In this split-second, life-or-death moment, The 40 Thieves demonstrated exactly why they were the most lethal asset on the island. Facing an armored armada that could turn them to paste in seconds, opening fire with their carbines would be suicide. Lieutenant Tachovsky was terrifyingly calm. He forced his trigger-happy men to hold their fire, aggressively ordering them to stay completely invisible. Pulling back into the thickest foliage, he ordered his radio man to set up the portable comms gear. With enemy sentries prowling mere yards away, the radio man, sweating profusely, encrypted the exact coordinates of the armored division and beamed them straight to the offshore naval command. Then came the agonizing wait. Every passing second felt like an hour. One wrong move meant they would be blown to ash. But less than 20 minutes later, the wrath of God fell from the sky. American destroyers offshore unleashed a catastrophic barrage. 5-inch naval shells, weighing dozens of pounds each, screamed down from the heavens and slammed directly into the concealed staging ground. Lying flat in the mud just a few hundred yards away, the Thieves watched in awe as the jungle was literally erased from existence. In a chain reaction of earth-shattering explosions, all 37 TYP-E-97 tanks, along with their crews, were instantly reduced to twisted, burning scrap metal. A massive, highly coordinated armored strike that could have changed the course of the battle was entirely wiped out before it even began. It was a monumental victory, yet the ultimate tyranny was that as those enemy soldiers vanished in the flames, they never even knew who had called down the Reaper upon them. As the battle ground on, the missions handed to the Thieves became increasingly suicidal. Always operating miles ahead of the main advance, they mapped every inch of the treacherous terrain. Saipan's geography was a defender's dream: steep ravines, suffocating vegetation, and deep limestone caves provided the enemy with endless natural ambush points. While carefully navigating a brutal 15-mile-long, 40-foot-deep gorge, their worst nightmare became a reality. The enemy had set a flawless trap. In an instant, the high ridges on both sides of the canyon erupted in muzzle flashes. Having absolute high ground, the enemy poured a devastating deluge of lead down on the trapped Marines. A normal platoon would have been wiped out in minutes. But once again, Tachovsky's cold-blooded leadership took over. He didn't order a panic retreat that would just make them moving targets. Instead, utilizing giant boulders and tangled tree roots, he instantly broke the platoon into tiny, autonomous fire teams. The raw, unspoken brotherhood forged in bar fights and prison yards kicked in, laying down highly accurate, perceived sniper fire to pin down the enemy machine gunners. They aggressively leapfrogged toward the canyon exit. Not only did they miraculously survive the crossfire intact, but while executing a flawless fighting retreat, they actually managed to snipe and kill multiple enemy officers, making the enemy pay a heavy toll. But what truly made this unit legendary was their borderline insane creativity when things went sideways. As the U.S. forces prepared to assault Saipan, the heavily fortified capital of Saipan, Marine commanders desperately needed a layout of the city's defenses, troop concentrations, and artillery nests. Going in blind meant walking into a slaughterhouse. Around 5:15 in the afternoon, a scout nicknamed Cuz was probing the outskirts of the ruined city. He found something buzzer leaning against a half-destroyed wall, 5 perfectly intact civilian bicycles. Amidst the craters, corpses, and burning rubble, these bikes looked completely absurd. But the minds of the 40 Thieves operated on a different frequency. They didn't see junk, they saw the ultimate. Silent, high-speed reconnaissance vehicles gifted to them by God himself. To map the city before nightfall, 5 of these absolute madmen actually got on those squeaky bicycles and rode straight into the heart of the enemy-occupied capital like heavily armed ghost riders. Because they didn't have the loud, roaring engines of a military jeep, they used the fading twilight and the shadows of the ruined buildings to glide silently past heavy guard posts. They mapped every hidden machine gun nest, artillery battery, and true rally point, memorizing the coordinates flawlessly. Then, they quietly pedaled right back out of the city, delivering intelligence that paved the way for a devastatingly successful American siege. A tactic this absurd, this suicidal, yet so spectacularly effective, could only have been pulled off by a gang of rule-breaking outlaws. But war is a ruthless meat grinder, and nobody is invincible forever. The incredibly reckless combat style of the 40 Thieves meant they were constantly dancing on the razor's edge of death. On the night of June 16th, chaos consumed the front lines. A massive enemy charge shattered the American perimeter, leading to brutal, hand-to-hand combat in the pitch black. When dawn finally broke and the squad regrouped, a devastating reality hit them. 17 of their brothers were missing in action. Among these criminals, loyalty was the only religion. Tachovsky wasn't about to leave a single man behind. He instantly assembled a 6-man hunter-killer rescue team, and in the dim morning light, willingly walked right back into the active war zone, risking full encirclement. It was a suicide mission. After a grueling search, deep inside a hidden limestone cave system, they finally found 5 of their missing brothers, hopelessly pinned down by an enemy patrol. The trapped Marines were completely out of ammo, severely dehydrated, and at death's door. One was burning up with malaria, slipping into a coma, while another was so ravaged by dysentery he couldn't even stand. The rescue team faced a nightmare. They had to carry dead weight across a mile of open ground, completely dominated by enemy machine guns. Their usual stealth tactics wouldn't work. They didn't have the time to be quiet, and the wounded were fading extremely fast. In a moment of pure madness, Tachovsky made the call, screw stealth. They were going to use pure, blinding speed to survive. Throwing the unconscious men over their shoulders, they broke cover and launched into a dead sprint straight through the kill zone. Enemy spotters screamed, alarms wailed loudly, and bullets cracked through the air like hornets, kicking up dirt at their heels. Fueled by pure adrenaline and seamless tactical coordination, the rescue team laid down vicious covering fire while on the dead run. Beating the impossible odds, they crashed through the jungle and dragged every wounded man back just before the traps snapped shut. Despite the incredible miracles they pulled off, the price they paid was horrific. Throughout the grueling weeks, they never rested. They operated in a state of maximum psychological stress behind enemy lines non-stop. They endured the suffocating jungle heat. They faced lethal tropical diseases, extreme sleep deprivation, and the constant paranoia of a sniper bullet finding them in the dark. Their supply lines were non-existent. When they starved, they risked their lives to aggressively raid heavily guarded enemy ration dumps. When they thirsted, they drank from muddy tropical streams that were highly likely to be contaminated by rotting corpses nearby. When the island was finally declared secure on July 9th, the heavy butcher's bill was tallied out of the original 40 outcasts. 12 were buried in for unsoil, 9 others worse, severely maimed for life, suffering a 56% casualty rate. The highly unorthodox squad stood victorious, but they were deeply battered and tragically diminished in the light of the setting sun. With their blood-and lives, they proved they were not the disposable trash of the Marine Corps, but its absolute sharpest tactical blade. Post-war military assessments confirmed that the relentless sabotage and reconnaissance conducted by the 40 Thieves was highly effective. It had severely crippled the enemy defense grid, directly reducing overall American casualties by an estimated 15% in the campaign. These incredibly dangerous lone wolf operations saved the lives of thousands of young Americans. The military system had branded them as failures. These convicted criminals achieved ultimate redemption in the unforgiving fires of hell, becoming the truest kind of heroes the military ever saw. While the physical war ended, the psychological war inside them raged on forever. The survivors returned carrying bodies full of shrapnel. Their minds were deeply fractured by unspeakable trauma. The dark nightmare of the bloody jungle clung to them like an unbreakable demon. Many developed severe post-traumatic stress disorder before the medical world had a name for it. In the 1940s, there was no therapy. For these highly trained men who mastered combat in the dark, civilian peace was a form of psychological torture. They were plagued by severe night terrors. Many turned to the bottle, desperately trying to drown their wartime demons in alcohol. Others became isolated, unable to relate to normal society. They paid an incalculable psychological price for victory, yet for decades they were tossed aside and completely forgotten by the society they saved. They received absolutely no official recognition or mental health support. As for the architect of this legendary unit, Lieutenant Frank Tachovsky, he quietly returned home to Sturgeon Bay in Wisconsin. Relying entirely on his unbreakable grit, he eventually became the highly respected town mayor. Like many men who survived the terrifying inferno, he locked the bloody ghosts of Saipan deep inside a highly secure mental vault, never to be opened. He never spoke a word of his secret war, not even to his family. He took the legend to his grave when he passed away in 2011. It wasn't until his son was cleaning out a dusty basement and pried open a rusted military footlocker that the truth finally saw the light of day. Inside were 66-year-old highly classified combat reports, deeply yellowed historical photographs, and a terrifying, blood-stained casualty roster. Only then did the heartbreaking, adrenaline-fueled legend of the 40 Thieves finally piece itself completely together, deeply shocking the modern world. This makeshift unit, born out of necessity and composed of military outcasts, inadvertently revolutionized the entire landscape of modern warfare. The 6th Marine Regiment Scout Sniper Platoon was not just a cool war story. Strategists recognized them as the first true elite special operations unit. They are considered the undeniable forefathers of modern asymmetrical warfare. Their brutal doctrines involved small units operating deep behind enemy lines, mastering silent kills and crippling the enemy brain by severing their communications, and logistics became the foundational DNA for elite American forces. It is no exaggeration to say the court tactics utilized today by the U.S. Navy Special Forces trace their direct lineage straight back to this squad. They trace directly back to the bloody, predator-like warfare waged by the 40 Thieves in the extremely hostile, deeply unforgiving jungles of Saipan. 40 convicted criminals entirely abandoned by the system used the most ruthless methods possible to survive the absolute deadliest environment on Earth. Through blood, guts, and tactical brilliance, they ascended from disgraced prisoners to eternal military legends. Their story is the ultimate historical testament. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most unconventional military units, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more. I am your dedicated historical strategist, and I will see you on the front lines of our next incredible story.